if we go back 10, 15 years and I would try to get a board made for me, um, a lot of the times what happened is I rode really small boards. I felt undergunned almost all the time. But I think it's because most all of the shapers I went to at the time were men, and they're taking their models and they're shrinking them down for me. I think we were always for years encouraged to have these wide point forward if you want more foam in your board, more paddle power. Um, I've realized recently that especially for women or individuals that, maybe larger hips or whatnot, these pigs are great for them paddling. So I've started to make these pig longboards for, kind of people transitioning and wanting to nose ride. Turns out what makes a pro athlete is first and foremost money, exposure, and grit. And grit is so interesting to me. I think it's, the just the determination to be that human. And so where women have fallen behind, I think in so large a capacity is the sponsorships and the exposure.
I love geeking out on surfboards with people that know about surfboards. In this episode, I talked to Mando Surfboards shaper, and they make really cool, funky boards made for all abilities and all body types that get away from the traditional pointy nosed performance shortboard to boards that work in all conditions. And we get into a really great discussion about the difference between surfboards made for women and surfboards that are just marketed to women. We talk about their story in getting into surfing and getting into surfboard shaping, a little bit about identity, and of course, a hot topic for me right now, etiquette and how the rules of priority and privilege in the lineup may or may not be shifting. It's a hot topic and it happens at the very end of the conversation. So definitely stick around if that's something you're interested in. I hope that by listening to this that you learn something about surfboards and feel inspired to support a diversity of surfboard shapers. Well,
Yeah.
I'm so excited to finally get a chance to meet you. I've heard so much about you, but I realized in our conversation before that I actually don't know that much about you other than just hearing that you're a rad human. And yeah, I'm excited to get to know you.
It's interesting because, we have a lot of like common paths and, know a lot of the same people. And yeah, so I'm really, yeah, stoked I finally get to meet you properly.
Well, I want to hear about you. Where did you grow up and how did you get into surfing?
So I grew up in Monterey, California. That's where I am right now. Uh, I it's interesting because I get the question asked a lot, and I don't know. I don't know what that fuel was that made me want to be a surfer. Because I was naturally just good at sports and love sports, and that was my identity, that was my life. I sucked so hard at surfing. It was just like it was this thing where like how can I be good at football and basketball and suck at this other thing? And maybe that gave me more drive to do it. Monterey is not a learner friendly environment, just it's all beach breaks or rocky reef. It's very exposed. So, we have, probably more like big gnarly waves than we do, cute little learners. Like it's just night and day from like Santa Cruz, for instance. I also came from like a country club family, like tennis and golf, and my parents didn't go to the beach. So like when I started doing like little contests and stuff, like just as an example, my mother showed up to the contest in high heels.
That's
So
epic.
yeah. So yeah, it was a tough beginning.
How how like set us in time, like how old
Okay.
were you, and like if you came from a family that didn't have wasn't a part of the beach culture, like how did you even discover it?
Yeah, I was able to walk to the beach, luckily when I was younger. So, and I grew up as a swimmer, so it was easy to get into it at that in that capacity. But I didn't really start until I was 16 years old because it was once I could get myself to the beach is when I really started to surf. And it was actually my mother's friend's trainer that got me into surfing. This like badass of a woman, Marcy Curry, who just was all grit. And she just, yeah, there was only a handful of women in the whole community that surfed. And she kind of took me under her wing.
And so
Yeah.
you got into it, and you mentioned competitions. Like, were you like, I'm gonna be a pro surfer, or I'm gonna compete because I'm a competitive person?
So growing up a jock, I took all of that competitiveness and everything and put it into surfing. And yes, I definitely wanted to be a pro surfer. It never happened. And like I look back at my surfing, and I'm like, ooh, rightfully so. You know, it's it was very much, and maybe you could relate to this. It's like there's so much identity in surfing that I felt like I had to work to give it some purpose. And maybe I'm having a therapy moment here now too, because I'm kind of going, oh God, is that why I'm a shaper? There's got to be meaning in this thing that I'm absolutely obsessed with. So yeah, so I started doing contests, just like local contests and some of that like California Volcom stuff. And it never really went well because I was more of a team sport person than a singular athlete, and I always felt way too much pressure. I would hide in my van and like I just didn't enjoy it. So,
Are we similar in age? Like, because I remember the era of the Volcom contest, and I think I was sort of on the
hmm
older age, like an older end of the spectrum when that was happening.
I totally lied about my age to keep doing them. I think there was like a cap of 25 or something, and I remember being like, almost 30 and being like 23, just so I could surf in an amateur contest. That's ridiculous. But yeah, I got beat out by like 13-year-olds all the time.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Right on. Okay,
Uh,
well, so then continue the story. So growing up in Monterey, got into surfing at age 16, was
hmm
competing in amateur events through your late teens and 20s. And then
hmm
where did you do with yourself?
Yeah. Let's see. College was LA. Went on exchange, lived in Australia for a good bit, lived on the Gold Coast. So, surfed my brains out there. Came back with the intention of going to grad school, um, but didn't have the money to do so. And, I came from a family that could absolutely support that, but I came from two entrepreneurial parents who were like, no, dude, you're not doing that. And so I got into family business, which was hospitality and property management. And this is like a whole, like, if you saw that person compared to this person you're looking at, you'd be like, holy shit. I had long, big curly hair. I wore dresses. I was involved in Carmel politics, like small town politics. I sat on several boards. I was part of the Chamber of Commerce, the Economic Advisory Committee, whole different human. And I was absolutely miserable. So, because it wasn't who I was. So,
You were doing those things, like, were you aware that I'm doing this even though this isn't who I am, but I feel like I have to do it? Or had you really realized that there was such a disconnect between who you were being and who you actually were inside?
it's a really complicated question because I think that it so much of who you think you're supposed to be, I think comes, or this definition of success comes from pleasing the people around you or following this linear path that you think leads to success. For my family, especially my relationship with my father, I thought, yeah, the better I am as a business person, the better our relationship's going to be, the prouder he's going to be, yada yada yada. Um, and it's also complicated because, I live in an amazing place, like close to the beach. I got to surf every morning. I had a very solid job, a great partner from Norway, two dogs, like a house. I had the whole like package. And it was all bullshit. It just that wasn't what success was for me. So I didn't necessarily quit. I actually still run a little inn in Carmel. That's my real job that nobody knows about. Um, and I started working for, oh, you're gonna know the company. I started working for your competitor, essentially. I worked for Surf Las Olas in
Oh, nice.
Mexico. Yeah, I joke that's a competitor. It's
Yeah,
actually not at all how
I
I
don't
see
really.
it.
Yeah, I feel don't
Yeah,
feel competitive really with anybody.
no, no, I just thought it was kind of funny that
Yeah.
we live these kind of parallel lives. So Surf Las Olas is owned by Bev Sanders, who her and her husband started Avalanche Snowboards, which was the one of the first like snowboard companies back with like Burton and all that. And so she ended up making the first female snowboard, which is, aside from the whole idea of shrink it and pink it. And then I think they left that life and she started Las Olas and um, she's really become like an incredible mentor for me because I think growing up in Monterey where there was only a handful of women, and so few women in the media, female surfers that I could identify with, um, doing Las Olas, which I think also very much parallels with Surf with Amigas, suddenly there was a safe space for surfing that didn't have all the bullshit. Um, I didn't have to like mask anymore. I didn't have to perform. I didn't feel like an outsider. So I fully committed myself to Las Olas.
And what were you doing for them?
I came on originally as like their coordinator. Um, but when I got there, I think after about a year, I was like, I want to be a coach. So I just became a coach, and then would do projects for them on the side. I helped develop their like intermediate camp, which was called Masolas, and which was my favorite. I like working with intermediate surfers, and yeah, I did that. I still do that. It's actually been 11 years, maybe.
Nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And somewhere along the way, you were starting to say that you recognized that this life you were living was not you. Like, was that a sudden thing or sort of like little choices that all sort of led you in a different direction?
I think a lot of it had to do with stepping into spaces where I could see myself more fully. I think Los Olas was very much the catalyst for that. I'm like, wow, I can teach people how to surf. There was a different kind of stoke that came with helping people, you know, pop up on waves, riding their first wave, like, or even this idea of like what took me years to learn with just a little bit of instruction, people could learn in a freaking week, you know? Admittedly, a bit jealous about it, but and so yeah, that was so much more fulfilling. So it was really hard for me to come back to this other life. So gradually over the years, I've been letting go of that life. So no, not sudden, just this gradual where it was always a bit of a splitting of my time. I just started committing more and more to these kind of the surf lifestyle and industry.
And at what point did the shaping come into it?
The shaping's an interesting one because I admittedly have always had an obsession with how different boards can give you an entirely different sensation on the wave. And I just loved that. Like, Monterey is very much like chippy shortboard guy. and it's so hard to get this community to think outside of that. And I was always like, but wait, this single fin, like it feels so different, and I loved the long lines, or like riding a twin fin and like popping up and then suddenly taking that high line, and so I became a little bit of a board hoarder, long story short.
And where were you getting these boards?
I mean, so I worked for the local surf shop, which was Sunshine Freestyle. And I also was on their surf team. And so we got deals, as the team, we got deals on all different boards and stuff. But the owner was a garage shaper. And he, every new board that came through the shop, we would put on a rack and we'd take a straight edge to it and take the measurements. And so for years, I had a much more in-depth understanding of the elements that really make a good fun board, and the combination of those different elements. I think it was the almost like the female in me, or the female presenting version of me that thought I couldn't be a shaper. Like the only other shaper I knew was Ashley Lloyd. And um and so it's just so I think I look back at that and I'm like, God, representation is so important, because I really just didn't think it was something I was capable of doing. And then it was just another local friend who one day was like, hey, I'm shaping at this shop. This used to be the Route 1 shop. And the owner and primary shaper at the time opened it up to other shapers. And that's kind of how I got my in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem to be a combination of representation and believing that I could do this, and then also the logistics of like being able to do it, because you
Hmm.
need, well, yeah, you could set up on your kitchen table, I guess, technically, but like really it's like you need a room and you need the lights at a certain level and you need the tools and the access to the blanks and all that. Like it's
Hmm.
not super easy to, it's not like go down to Costco and buy a soft top and now you can go be a surfer. Like if you want to be a shaper, there are some barriers to getting into that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to say, this is maybe a little more, as far as the shaper world, a little more controversial, right? The hand shapers versus like those who use a CNC and the computer and whatnot. And I'll kind of dig my heels in on this one, as I do believe in accessibility. And hand shapers, you need a mentor. There needs to be an apprenticeship. Again, you need the spaces, you need the access, the knowledge. The to build a surfboard on OccuShaper or Shape 3D, all you need is, I think, $10 a month, and you can download a program and start making boards.
I don't know. I mean, I kind of shaped a board at one point, like many years ago, where I took a beat up longboard and peeled the glass off, and with very rudimentary tools, I shaped it into a surfboard and never glassed it. But like
Yeah,
when I look at those programs, I mean, it's, to me, it's not at all intuitive. Like to see,
true.
to like, I feel like I hear what you're saying, but that the computer program maybe like skips some steps, but I feel like it still takes that, like that eye to be like, okay, if I move this little axis this way, like what is that actually going to be in the final I don't know, maybe it's just my brain doesn't work that way, but when I've sat down with shapers who are making me a board and sat at the computer, they're like, okay, here you go, and I'm like, how does it look? I'm like, I mean, it's the shape of a surfboard, but I need to hold it under my arm, I need to touch it.
I do that to my customers all the time. I send them a little 3D and I'm like, what do you think? And they're usually like, yeah.
You think it looks good, I trust you.
I, that's very, very valid. And before I got into shaping, again, like I said, I had this other education, of somebody taking me under their wing and showing me what every single thing does. And so when I got on the computer, I was able to go, oh, okay, I like it when my rails are like this, like, and I knew, to a certain extent how deep I wanted my concaves and, things like that. And then over time, working within a community of shapers, and that's also where I'm very lucky, is that this shop had so many different shapers who weren't proprietary. Like I'd be building a board and I'm like, oh God, like where do I put my fins on this thing? And somebody would shout from another room, like, yeah, I go 10 and 3/4 and 3 1/4. And, okay, cool, thanks. So there is a lot, finding your community in this stuff is really valuable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you finally believed that it was something you could do, and you had someone that kind of brought you in and gave you the
Mhm.
start and some tips, and going from that to creating a brand like that, then it takes some effort there. And like, at what point did you decide, I want to do this?
Yeah, I think that's just kind of a very early on learned issue of mine, coming from two entrepreneurial parents. Again, the idea of success meant that it had to be a business, it had to make money, it had to. So I did that very early on, started building it. But I think it's also part of my personality is that once I started building boards, I this is the same with surfing. Once I started building boards, I could not stop thinking about it, and the this shop, which now I own, by the way. So this shop has existed for 8 years prior to my ownership, but it's a fully, running factory, glasses boards for multiple clients, multiple different shapers. Um, I couldn't just come in here during the day. Like they're fully, they're running. So I would be in this shop until 2, 3, 4 in the morning, because I would get obsessed. And whether it was the shaping of the board, the airbrushing, whatever it was at the time, it's like, those were my times that I could work. And so I became a night owl and just did it.
Nice. Tell me, tell me about the name Mondo. Where does that come from, or what does it mean to you?
Oh, yeah. Well, so um, I'm non-binary. I'm agendered. My given name is Amanda. And it's interesting because that name never worked for me, and I think it never worked for the people that knew me. Um, and so people try to give me nicknames, and they didn't sit. And one day, someone gave me the nickname Mando, and and that just suddenly worked. And then I really claimed it more as as my name, because such a feminine name didn't work for me. So now, I go exclusively by Mando. Old friends and family members will still call me Amanda from time to time, and it's not like Amanda is it's not a dead name for me. It's not a different identity. It's just, yeah, it's just given name versus chosen name, frankly.
Got it. Okay, so I was calling it Mondo. So Mando, thank you.
Mando.
Awesome.
Yeah, no worries.
And what is the surfboard business like these days? It seems like it's not an easy place to exist.
Dude, what am I doing? Not only was like creating a brand so difficult, um, now I've got this freaking factory, and it's it is one of those things where I'm lucky I have a business that's a functional running business, because otherwise this is 100% just a passion project. The surf industry is really going through it right now. I think from multiple angles. We've seen in Santa Cruz, I have seen multiple shops, close down in the last year or so. Um, I think a lot of it, there's something very special about being able to go to an individual, go to a shaper, and say, this is how I surf. These are the waves I surf. What I need a surfboard. Tell me what I need. You can't, I can't think of any other industry where you could do that, and but I think that and not to over criticize, but I think it's just we are surfers. We live in a very insular community, and as a community, I think we've been reluctant to open it up. And I think within the industry, we've done a lot of the same thing. We've held really tight to traditions, a lot of reluctance to open it up and change things. And I think the result has been these salty, kind of angry shops. And it feels, and I don't want to say that it's intentional, but it feels very exclusionary. I even remember the same thing about surf shops, going in and just almost feeling like, am I allowed to be here? You know, like, I'm going to give you money, but is that okay? So I think that these factories and stuff, it's a lot like that too.
Yeah, well,
Um,
well, it's interesting because to me, it seems like the number of surfers is more than there's ever been. I mean, I don't have the raw data, but just I feel like every single spot that I have ever surfed, it's more crowded now than it used to be.
hmm
And so then it's surprising that then in the same breath we can say that the surf industry is struggling, because in theory the surf industry should be like exploding with more clients than they've ever had. So I hear what you're saying as far as the salty dog issue, that like one reaction to how many surfers there are has been to get
hmm
even more like kind of, no, we've got to stay core and like, you know,
Right, right.
salty. But then you would think that all these surfers have to buy surfboards, right?
Yeah. So I think that then there's the next level of it is that surfboards have not adjusted for inflation or cost of managing a factory in states like California. And so when, you know, often customers are quite frustrated by the price of the surfboard, and I get it. They are high ticket items, Um, but then I think the result is we start to look at these mass produced boards that are produced overseas, and they're driving the prices down. Um, and it's unfortunate because, now they're feeling more comfortable almost buying a board online without any real knowledge of what kind of board they really need. And if we're going to compare the surfboards to, let's say, skiing, the or snowboarding, the mountain is always there. The snow conditions change, but certain elements stay pretty consistent. With surfing, like I could go, like I was a skier, I could have like a small quiver of skis, keeping in mind I am a gearhead of sorts. So, I would have more than maybe needed, but I could have a small quiver of skis and ski for years and years and years with that. But with surfing, you could have a quiver of 20 boards surfing those all over the world, like that the waves change so much even in a single session, that it is so nice to have a shaper that knows your area, know your waves, knows your ability, but we don't want to pay for it. Or it's hard to pay for, I should say.
Well, I feel like even for me, I have a hard time knowing what to ask for. And like if I have a hard time knowing what to ask for, like someone who's been
Very
surfing
good
for
point.
30 years and was a professional surfer, and I have
Hmm
hundreds of boards scattered all over the place that I could claim as like my surfboards. Like I know a lot about surfboards, and even me, I mean,
Yeah.
you and I had a conversation on Instagram, like let's talk about making a board, and I'd be like, I don't
hmm
even know what I want. And so
But then Yeah, but then I see that as part of my job. I have a series of questions I'm going to ask you. It's like, okay, well, is there a spot in your quiver you want to fill? Like what wave are you going to be surfing this on? What size? Like what's your intention? And then, you start answering these slightly more arbitrary questions and maybe more vibes and feels. And then it's my job to be like, okay, I think this would work, you know?
yeah.
And yeah, where else do you have that?
No,
You
for
know?
sure. Yeah, I
Yeah.
I I hear that, and I think that that is cool. I know that too. like thinking about what is the other side thinking. It's like that combination of like you can scroll through a catalog of boards and read the little paragraph and be like, this one is for, you know, Hawaii waves, or this one is for, you know, this is for the larger bodied person that is maybe not in the
Mm-hmm.
best shape but still wants to rip, and you know, all of those things. And then you can order it and it can be like, well, I was living in Central America for a long time, and then I spent 2 years living in California, and I did not want to bring my boards from Central America back to California because that seems silly. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I left them in Central America, but now I'm living in California and I don't have any boards. And I started looking at, oh, I was like, I'm going to get a board from like a local shaper because like that's roots and that's
Yeah.
cool. And then I'll be respected in the lineup because I'll be riding like the right brand of board. And I had all these thoughts, and then I looked into ordering a board, and like there's a female shaper in San Diego that this was like 4 or 5 years ago now. I can't remember what her name was. That like she had popped up on Instagram. She was making these really cool looking boards. And I reached out to
Yeah.
her and she was like, oh, I have a year-long wait list. And I was like,
Good
okay.
for her.
Yeah, good for her. And then I reached out to these other like trippy shapers because I was like, wanted to get something cool, you know? I want to get something
Mm-hmm.
funky. I didn't want to just get an Almeric or something, you know, or Rusty. And anybody I reached out to, the wait time was like 3 months and beyond. I'm like, no, I need a board now because I want to go
Yeah.
surfing next week. And then I started looking online. I'm like, oh, I'll just get a board online to tide me over. And I ordered a Salt Gypsy board because I was like, well, it's a female.
Mm-hmm.
She's at least getting royalties or whatever. And it showed up on my
Mm-hmm.
doorstep in 2 days.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so it's like it's hard to compete against that, as you know, the service
Mm-hmm.
that you're offering is rad and roots
Mm-hmm.
and it feels good, but it's also like you're fighting an uphill battle.
For sure. And the business person in me, coming from, kind of a, very competitive business like hospitality, the very first thing I look at is that, to be honest, is like people don't want to wait, and I think that also even just with the ebb and flow of surfboard orders, I hate to say it because it sounds crazy, but whatever the swell's doing, like if suddenly there's a big swell, like I just know, like, okay, I'm gonna get a handful of orders from this because we, maybe it's just part of who we are as surfers. We are so in the moment. So like I get to the beach, I need this board. And I feel that, So like here, we do try to do fast turnaround. Like I really try to make it at least at the later end, longer end, like 3 weeks or so. And I try to have stock. I try to push models more than like full customs. If someone explains to me what they want and the model works, I'm like, I've refined that. It's like, here, take the model. Um, and I think that comes from just so many of us are shapers on the side too. Like we can't afford to really run like a full business. And so then those shapers give it to a shop like mine, which is a contract shop. And then, suddenly we get this long list and they're not waiting on, basically they're waiting on us.
Right.
So yeah, yeah.
Do you have like pet models or like models that you feel like are like I was browsing your website a little bit yesterday or the day before, and there's a lot of like really cool stuff on there that looks, it's different, you know,
Mhm.
it's not like if you were to look at like one of like the big name brands of, I don't know, whoever, Lost or Almeric or Sharp Eye, whatever, like the cool kid brands are these days in that
Yeah,
like more traditional surfing realm, you know, with all the
yeah.
pointy nose shortboards and then some like step downs and whatever. Like your stuff looked really cool. So what's your philosophy around boards, or what are you into?
So somewhere along the line, I shifted from shortboard guy to alternative models. Um, and that's primarily because of where I live. We've just got shit waves. We've got waves that, on a good day can be good, but they're very shifty. We're much, like I said before, much more exposed. So I started making these alternative, slightly retro boards that they work in everything. And the reason they work in everything is because I do a good job of hiding foam. I drop my rockers a bit for, just getting that extra paddle. I hide V in the right places to cut through chop or to make the board more responsive. I've got a formula to just make it fun to surf every day,
I
you
think it's
know?
I think it's interesting that when you're talking about these things like volume and flattening rocker and hiding V, that it's all phrased in the sense of like I'm hiding it. Like it's
Yeah.
not it's like oh this is talk about why you use that language. Like I have to hide these elements.
Yeah, it's actually, you're right. Maybe in part it is like I've hidden it so it's still this rippy thing. I think also, you know, if we go back 10, 15 years and I would try to get a board made for me, um, a lot of the times what happened is I rode really small boards. I felt undergunned almost all the time. But I think it's because most all of the shapers I went to at the time were men, and they're taking their models and they're shrinking them down for me. And at the time I was maybe 120 pounds and I rode 24 to 25 liters. If I asked them to fit more foam in the board, and again, to your earlier point, like even with my surf experience, I didn't know to specify changing certain things. I would often get these boards that were too full in the rails. So now I'm paddling great. I'm loving that split second extra setup time, but I cannot set my rail. Skidding out on cutbacks, feeling bulky, feeling detached from the wave. So when I say hide foam, a lot of it also has to do with, me talking to a female surfer that perhaps can relate to that, where it's like, I can hide that foam in there, but I'm going to keep your rails nice and spicy. Or, I foil out my tails a lot for women or smaller people. That's something I never knew is that I'm not driving that tail in as hard as my, like Calvin back there, who's, 60 pounds heavier than me or something. So it's kind of understanding too, like who's surfing this board,
Yeah.
and
I
yeah.
wonder if that language around hiding is just like going
Hmm.
back to that tradition of what's cool is short and chippy and rippy, and we know that in these kind of waves, or just like not being 20-year-old aspiring pro surfers, that we do want a little bit more foam and a little flatter rocker, but in order to stay cool it's got to be hidden.
Absolutely. It's nobody wants because we're all taught to look at the pros and what the pros are writing. And if I ride that board, I'm going to rip. They're writing crazy boards, the tiniest freaking stuff that, like, I'm in my 40s now. I'm like, I can't ride that thing. Forget it. So yeah, I think that putting foam in the right places is really important. Um, like right now, I'm loving like old like pig shapes from longboard pigs to I'm doing a lot of mid-length pigs, and to clarify, bringing that wide point back so there's all this foam behind you, and it makes less swing weight, makes it so much more pivoty, so for like those, if we're getting into like a mid-length concept, which I love mid-lengths these days, something with the wide point back, you're just suddenly, you can churn this thing instead of, like, I think we were always for years encouraged to have these wide point forward if you want more foam in your board, more paddle power. Um, I've realized recently that especially for women or individuals that, maybe larger hips or whatnot, these pigs are great for them paddling. So I've started to make these pig longboards for, kind of people transitioning and wanting to nose ride, whereas before I'd make kind of a neutral shape. And I just, like my partner has a little more curve. and I put this pig under, and now you've got all the foam under her hips, and it lifts the tail, and suddenly she's paddling into these waves better than I've ever seen her paddle in. I'm like, oh, we've never talked about beginner women or what that might do, or yeah.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting. I feel like it's an interesting topic to talk about with somebody like you. Is that whole idea of like these boards are made for women, right? Because I
Hmm.
have that is something that I feel like is rare to see. It's like even in the like mass produced surfboard realm to the like high performance Rusties and Merricks and Loss and whatever, like I don't know that I've really seen much of a board that's like made for women. And when I did move back to California and I talked about my initial struggles to get a board, and I ended up reconnecting with Rusty Surfboards, who had sponsored me all through my pro career.
Right.
And I went to Rusty and I said, hey, I'm living in California for a few years. I don't know how many, but I'm going to be doing, coaching for women, and I run this women's surf camp. And I feel like there's like a missing piece in the market of boards that are specifically marketed to women. So like, let's work on it. Like, let's get a women's model going. But then it does like bring up the question is like, well, what do women need? And was recently in California, and I went to the album shop in San Clemente that
Hmm.
they make those Coco Ho boards, and I was chatting with the guy there because that's something that I don't know if you've seen. Have you checked those boards out? Those Coco Ho
Yeah.
boards? I was
Yeah.
blown away by how narrow they are. They're
Yeah.
they're actually super narrow, which is to me was counterintuitive because I feel like there's a lot of, the ideas that, well, women maybe in general don't paddle as fast or as strong, just like the way that our bodies are built are typically like less muscular than a cis man would be with the testosterone and all the things. And of course we're making big generalizations, but
Hmm.
so maybe women would need more width or more volume, and sometimes women can be, curvier or whatever, so more volume would be helpful. So it was surprising to me that they're making these boards for women that were so narrow. And the guy was saying the reason was that it are women's shoulders are generally narrower. So in order to like get more paddle power, if you have to like reach around the rails, which I just never heard that before, I was like, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. But what do you think? Like, do you I heard you mention boards for women. So
Yeah. Yeah. I'm no, I'm scratching at the idea of it being a paddle thing. So I think before, like, because you said that there is a lot of big generalizations in this, and I think that it feels that way because women have been left behind in so many of these industries for so long that these conversations, they're just not as common as they should be. We are decades behind in all of this. So it feels easier to say board for women, board for men. But we know that it's way more complicated than that. And then it becomes easy to say that men are stronger than women. It's interesting. There's a study that was done a couple years ago, and as I've been active in the past as far as trans inclusion and equity in women's surfing and all of that. And there was an interesting study, and I'm forgetting the source right now, but what it was what makes a pro athlete, and comparing men and women. And the assumption is that the strength, lung capacity, wingspan of men is what's going to make a better athlete. Turns out what makes a pro athlete is first and foremost money, exposure, and grit. And the grit is so interesting to me. I think it's, the just the determination to be that human. And so where women have fallen behind, I think in so large a capacity is the sponsorships and the exposure, where it is so easy to train and commit yourself to your craft when it was fully funded and you don't have a side job. I think about Bianca Valenti is a fantastic example that she's out there charging these massive waves while running a restaurant in San Francisco at the same time. Like, can you imagine the extra effort that she has to put in that like her training wasn't funded, or I don't know to what extent it was or was not, but I think she's a great example of that. Um, so then when we bring it back to like surfboards, I try to be careful about my terminology because then it also makes these assumptions, right? That the man is stronger and therefore a narrower board for narrower shoulders. Um, I think, and I just made it so complicated, but I think that when I talk about boards for women or boards for smaller bodies, I'm trying to fill that space instead of drawing a line between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think I'll be honest and say I was almost surprised to hear you even say it because I wonder, like, is it
Mhm.
necessary? Is it necessary to separate? Because my experience has been in the past, typically, if there's a board for women, there's this assumption that they're not as good of a surfer,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's like somebody who is, not as fit potentially or not as skilled or both. And so the
Hmm.
model for a woman is going to be higher volume and a prettier color, but like the and that's where maybe the cocoa boards are the exception because I don't know how much Coco herself is involved in the making of those boards.
Right.
Maybe a lot, maybe not at all. Maybe it's just marketing. I don't actually know. But obviously, she is a smaller sized, but very fit and very good surfing woman. So to me, like those boards are made for her because she's small
Hmm.
and rips, like the boards that I was
Right.
looking like did not seem suited for kind of a advanced beginner, or recreational female surfer that just surfs when she can, that isn't like a
Yeah.
real dedicated. So it's interesting to even like bring the gender into it at all. Like,
Yeah. I think it's so hard because I try to find a way of talking about this all the time that doesn't make it overly binary. I think what is difficult about it is on a social level. Like when I lived in San Francisco, a large majority of my community is queer. Our conversation is the way we talk about each other, all of that is so not this binary. We've eliminated a lot of heteronormative roles. We our our language kind of suits the community, if that makes sense. But then I have that version of me, that existence, and then I take that and I put it in this industry that is so far behind as far as that language. I've accepted in Monterey, most people don't get my pronouns right, which is they, them. Most people don't even understand if I tell them they, them. And so to talk about it's almost like you're trying to talk about this stuff on two different planes.
yeah,
Does that make
it
sense?
does. It's like
Yeah.
you're moving into a different language. You're like, there's like certain words that like don't exist in a different
Yeah.
language because like that concept just isn't familiar. So you have to like find the closest word to describe what you're trying to say. Like that makes sense.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. And so I think that Coco Ho's brand, I, I have opinions about it. One, I think it's great that there's this money and this energy behind it, and that there is a highlight on these boards with these specific elements that can be really great for smaller stature surfers and all of that. It does feel a little shrink it and pink it to me, which, the color palette, the idea that originally it was, Matt's shapes with cocoa, and that really bothered me. I actually confronted him on social media and was like, yeah, dude, it'd be a lot cooler if it's a female shaper,
Right.
and then since then I think he's brought on uh Avila, is
Yeah.
that her name?
So Avalon,
Yeah,
somebody. I know you're talking. I saw
Avila,
that.
yeah. So great step forward. Great that there's a space being taken up by that. Not helpful in the sense that we are talking about different rails, different tails, narrower, because it happens to be two non-males talking about boards. Like it's naturally going to come up between us.
Yeah.
Like we need more of that space. We need more of that representation. Um, and so it's like that brand to me feels like a little bit like one step forward, two steps back.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that. It's like they're trying to do something by saying, look, we're being inclusive and we're going to do this thing for women and whatever, and we're going to make these high performance boards for women. But I agree, it's like there's at the same time it's kind of missing a little bit.
It is. We all got our phobias and everything kind of innate in us. Even, when I came out as queer, I had to face my homophobia. When I came out as trans, I had to face my transphobia. It's all real. I look back and I think that in the beginning, I was reluctant to buy a board from Ashley. Ashley's a, Santa Cruz shaper, and I think it took me, a good year or so to buy a board from her. Then I bought like four.
Why do you think that is? Like, I don't understand.
Ashley was the only one I'd ever seen, the only female shaper. And so my own stuff, my own bullshit at the time was like, if she's the only one, like, can she do it?
Mm-hmm.
There were those deep, deep, ugly, like rooted feelings that we have to address, because, and I feel it all the time, even Calvin, who works in the shop here, is like sometimes men will come in and look to him, it could be in a conversation with me, and then he says something and it's like, oh, the man said something, it still exists.
Yeah.
We might not think it's there, but it's definitely there, and then I got boards from Ashley, and fuck, she's a genius, she's been doing this for 25 years. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Got me on my little like ranting high horse there for a second.
I like it. This is the conversation. Yeah, I think that it just really comes back to the importance of kind of doing your research, right? Because one could say, oh well, it's a Coco's brand, so that's awesome, and just leave it at that. But I think you're right that it's important to look into it and go, okay, well, is this, if you're going in with the goal of like just having something cute, then who cares? But like if you're actually trying to do the quote unquote right thing and support diversity in shaping and potentially female shapers, then it's important to know, like, okay, this board that I'm getting, like me, I've ordered off the internet, but I was like, well, at least I'm going to choose the most female option, or at least she is hopefully getting some royalties from her name license.
Right.
So what are you personally riding these days? Like, do you rotate through like boards, like trying different things all the time? Or do you have your like go-to like standard favorites?
Again, gear order. So and it's an obsessive kind of thing. If I get an idea for a board or like what the current waves might need, I cannot stop obsessing until I make it in some capacity. Sometimes it's as much as just designing it in a CAD program, but other times it's like, I gotta produce this thing. So I'm lucky in that I work with a lot of other shapers, and we have this tight-knit like group. One of the locals, Brooke Boynton, he works under my label, and we R&D all the time. Every morning we go out trying something different. So the board I'm most excited about right now is very heavily influenced by Bob McTavish. He did a longboard called the Beatnik that's a V-bottom longboard, very parallel outline. And then a crazy bit about it that I love is it's got double concave in the nose. And so I wanted to make a nose rider that I could ride in beach breaks. It sounds like I'm a longboarder. I'm really not, but this is deeply out of necessity. So I wanted a nose rider that I could ride in beach breaks. So this thing's kind of like the mullet of surfboards. It's like it's an entirely different thing in the back than it is in the front. With that like crazy V, I can hit these sections and be really responsive. But if I've got a little line, I can get to the nose pretty quickly and easily. And so that thing I'm pretty jazzed about. because I was very intentional about something we needed, and it came out like pretty solid. Um,
Nice.
yeah,
Nice.
always obsessed with something.
Yeah, epic.
Yeah, yeah.
That
So
sounds good.
yeah, yeah.
Um, we're, how do you feel?
Um,
How do you feel about etiquette in the water? Talking about this is a conversation that I've been having a lot lately. Kind of to me, it goes a little bit in line with that conversation we had earlier around the gatekeeping and surfing and the crusty locals at the shop. And how do you feel that translates into the water, or
yeah,
how should talking about like, I think we can all agree on like old school etiquette that like respect the locals, and the guy that's been surfing there for before you were born like has more priority to waves than someone that just bought the fancy beach house 2 blocks away, and that beginners should sit wide and pay their dues and like work their way up in the lineup, and whoever's deepest has priority, unless it's the salty legend who's double arm
right.
paddling on the longboard out the back. Like those I would say are like the kind of traditional rules of etiquette. What of that do
Yeah.
you like and think that we should keep, and is there any of that that you're ready to throw out in favor of something different?
Okay. This is interesting because I've been an instructor for years, so I've been part of the bringing more surfers into the community. I believe heavily in the safety and knowing your community. Um, and I think that's a big part of it is that the surf community is a tight community. And so when you just kind of walk in, being unaware of that is an issue. Um, I'm gonna surprisingly stand a little bit on the side of traditional etiquette, but for different reasons. I think that if you travel to another country, I think the best way to be a traveler is to be educated and culturally sensitive to that country. I'm going to go in as a visitor and I'm going to respect that country as a space that has opened itself up to me. I'm a guest. So I think that it's good that we treat surf spots like that. I am a guest in someone's community, someone's everyday. Like this is a very sacred space to them. And so like whenever I go to a new spot, I really try to be respectful of that. Um, I also like to be aware of, how much we travel for surfing now and how much that is affecting communities on the coast. Like there is just a reality that like surfing is now a very privileged sport. There, like you said, the guy who just bought a house on the coast, there is almost a buy-in for surfing now. And I think that if you're going to be that person, if you're going to buy your way in, you need to understand like what has existed before you, you know. That being said, old 30, like I've been surfing here forever and therefore I get to paddle for this wave. I've never had a lot of respect for that. Um, but I've never had a lot of respect for that from the straight white cis males. I think something about that, like, I'm gonna go back to Marcy, the woman who taught me how to surf. For me, if Marcy paddles, I don't paddle. Like Marcy has given me so much. And what makes me so angry is when the Groms in our community don't recognize who this woman is and how much she's brought to surfing in this community. And they burn her or disrespect her or paddle around her. So there's this part of me that's like, I really wish the aunties in the world had more of that, especially as they're getting older and maybe their wave count's dropping and whatnot. So I don't know.
Yeah,
It's complicated.
it is complicated. I think the first thing to say is it's complicated and it's nuanced and it's tricky. I think that I agree with you 100% as far as like if you're new to a space that it's absolutely important to show respect, because the opposite of that is to say the ocean's for everyone and I don't care and I'm gonna take mine, and that is not at
Yeah.
all, that is nobody, I don't think
No.
anybody's advocating for that. I think that
Right.
what I see is, for example, I live in Costa Rica, and
Hmm.
my son was born here. I've lived here for a minute, and I show respect and take my turn and whatever. But sometimes I see Costa Ricans who are, of course, they are maybe overreacting or reacting justifiably, depending on your perspective, to so many gringos coming down. And then they
Right,
go with the I'm a local, and so I get all the waves. And and
right.
and that's where it's like it, or you don't even have to talk about, maybe it's like less contentious to talk about, some spot in San Diego where it's like the guy who had the privilege to grow up at that beach and therefore has been surfing there for 20 years, and then maybe someone
Hmm.
who didn't have that privilege, or has a job, didn't have the financial privilege to be able to dedicate 20 years to surfing because they've been
Yeah.
providing for their family and they can only go on the weekends or whatever it is. And to say that local has more right to a set wave to someone else, provided that someone else is safe, like their skill
Hmm.
level is appropriate to surf at that spot. Because definitely I'm not saying that beginners should paddle out at the peak, but that
Right, right.
provided someone has the basic skill level necessary and come into the space with respect and say hello and join the lineup and wait their turn, my argument is that that person should eventually get the opportunity to paddle for a set wave.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you then try to distill that into rules, one could say, hey, just because you're a better surfer or you've lived there longer does not give you more right to waves. And like
Hmm.
that, just saying that can be pretty incendiary, because then all of a sudden people start coming back with, well, you got to respect, you got to pay your dues, and beginners shouldn't be at the peak. And I'm like, no, no, no. I'm still saying respect and wait your
Hmm.
turn and make sure that you have the skill level. But I feel like that's like the nuance that is a hard conversation to have.
I think, to make it so black and white at its foundation, you're absolutely right. And it's hard. It's hard because it's difficult to frame anything in one period of time. But then for, the local that's been there and is, for all these different reasons, their space is just getting more and more and more crowded. I can absolutely understand the frustration in that, you know. But for me to go in with the intention of being aware of who's local, whose community this is, and maybe not being as assertive as I usually am. And then in return, I would expect the locals to then be like, not so greedy and not being unsafe and, if that makes sense.
Right.
To make it complicated.
And that's where I feel like, as a global community of surfers, like that is the message that I want to
Hmm.
start sharing, because I feel
Yeah.
like, when I grew up in Palos Verdes, which in California, which is like a super localized spot, and like the culture that I grew
Hmm.
up in said, if you live here and you're a good surfer, then you are more deserving of waves than anybody else. Like,
And that's not cool.
and
Why aren't we talking about how to surf, more as a community?
right.
Like I've known so many people, it's like it's to comment how funny, like new surfers especially, how funny it is that we're so silent in the water. Like this is more like you could be 30 people just sitting together silent, and when they brought that to my attention, I thought that's so interesting. It's so individual out there and we are not good. Remember that whole, it's gotten a little better now, but where people would hoot at you, you know? And I'm like, this is so interesting to me. I'm like 2 feet away. We have words for this. We could use words, but we've chosen to grunt at each other instead of actually speak, you know? So I think that there is something in the culture we've created that's making it so difficult to do this. um, I think also for people like you and I that have been surfing for 25 plus years, that there's a lot of unlearning to do also. I before I became an instructor, I would have been the person that's like, earn your spot, you know, the more you get beat up, the more you show up every day despite the conditions, the more deserving you are. And that's so deeply like rooted in me that it's I almost don't realize how toxic that is, you know, that we've created this kind of torture game, and that it's people like myself or you or that have been surfing for this long that can choose to stop that trend, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Not always easy.
It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that you're right on with that. It's like the women that uphold the patriarchy because they feel like that's how they're going to be successful in it. And then if
Yes.
you get to the point of like going, I don't need to, I have enough confidence in myself that I'm not going to try to fit into this mold anymore. Well, this has been super fun. Thank you for sharing your opinion and engaging in the conversation. And I'm so glad we got to have a chat.
Yeah, dude, that was so smooth and easy.